Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is going to be about promises and about making Ajax requests. So first, I'm just going to quickly kind of re-go over what a promise is. I do have a separate video that's just on what is a promise and how a promise works. Let me just kind of re-go over that again because it's good to know. And the basic summary is this. A promise is just a way to do things that don't finish right away. That way your code doesn't just stop. Okay, so basically there's something you need your code to do. It's going to take a while to do it, but you don't necessarily want your whole code to just stop while it does that. You want it to keep going. That's what a promise does. Okay? When a promise occurs, basically it tells JavaScript that, okay, there's this promise here. It's doing a thing, come back, check back later to see if this thing is done. Okay, and the code moves on, etc. So essentially a promise works like this, and you could use a promise for anything. Okay, and most of the time you're not necessarily creating your own custom promises. Depending on what you're doing, you're probably taking advantage of things that already return a promise. But it's nice to know how promises work, so that way when you work with those things, it makes more sense. Okay, so let's say const my promise. So this is we're gonna have a promise here. This equals a new promise. So a promise is a type of object. Okay, and this object, to create it, it takes a callback. And what this callback is just basically you pass in resolve and reject. Okay, which are these two functions that are magically passed in to this callback. You don't need to worry how those get in there, but they get passed in there. And basically what happens is that this promise is considered pending until this resolve or reject happens. So let's create a situation where one or the other would happen. And we want to make sure it takes some time so you can see how this kind of works. Let's do a set interval. So let's see here, set timeout actually. Set timeout. And when that timeout happens, what's going to happen is a callback gets kicked in. And then we're going to say if true, because we're just going to assume it's true. Then we're going to resolve the promise. So basically, we're going to, right, this first time it's just going to automatically happen because I set true to true, so it's going to be true. And it says, hey, and we're going to return. You don't really return with a promise, you resolve. And then whatever I pass in the resolve function is what the promise gives back. So it's like, hey, I've resolved. Or hey, I have resolved. Okay. Else. Okay. Reject. This promise has been rejected. Okay, cool. Save. Okay. Now, so essentially this promise happens, and we actually have to set a time for that to happen. So that's the second argument to set timeout. We'll say 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. Okay, so again, the set timeout, first argument is the callback function. Control Z. Is the callback function. What's this right here? And then the second argument is the number of milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. So we're going to say this. So basically, a promise gets created. This function kicks in right away, starts waiting 5 seconds, but because it's a promise, it tells the code just go do other stuff. Okay, so I'm going to set up a function saying console.log. Actually, I'll set up a couple different console logs. Console.log before the promise. So this is a console log that occurs before the promise starts. And here's a console log that happens after the promise starts. Cool. Now, if I try to console log my promise, right after the promise happens, watch what happens. Console log promise, or my promise. So let's just walk through this real quick. First, we're saying, hey, this happens before the promise. Then the actual promise gets created. Then I console log the promise to see what it gives me. And then I say, hey, this is after the promise. So let me just do that. Node testing.js. Okay, and notice we get promise pending. Okay, so why do we get that? So how am I supposed to use the information? How am I supposed to get this, hey, I have resolved? Because what happens is that, again, the promise hasn't actually resolved yet, but the code moves on. So basically, when I do console log my promise, it just shows me that it's pending because it hasn't resolved yet. But what if I want to make sure that I only want to console log it when it actually resolves? So the way promises work is that there's a function that you have to chain off of them. There's two of them. Okay. So the first one we're going to chain, actually we'll do it here, my promise. So here's the promise, and then I want to chain a dot then. A dot then takes a callback, and the callback takes in, we'll call it res data, meaning the data from the resolve. So it would get this piece of data, this string, takes it and executes this callback. So this dot then function will only execute if this promise resolves. So basically, in this case, this line runs. Okay, so basically, when this line runs, we'll say console.log res data, the data from the resolve. Okay, but what if something goes wrong? What if it doesn't? It gets rejected. Then I can chain a dot catch, which is the same thing except for if it goes wrong. So then here we'll say reg data. It's whatever comes back from the rejection. Okay, usually write error, but just trying to be a little extra deliberate here. Okay, so it's the data from the rejection that was done. Okay, so then we'll console.log reg data. So basically we're saying, first we create the promise. So here we create the promise. And then here we take that promise and we chain a dot then, which means when it resolves, do this. And we chain a dot catch, which means when it gets rejected, do this. Now let's see the order in that which all this code runs. Because technically, hey, this after the promise starts is after all of this. So it should be the very last thing that runs. But you see, after the promise has already happened. Because again, promises don't block your code. So they let your code keep going. And see, it waited, in 5 seconds it resolved, and then that dot then ran and console logged, hey, I have resolved. Now if I change this to false, it's going to hit the reject now. So watch what happens when it gets rejected. Okay. So then after 5 seconds, it will, promise has been rejected. So that's all a promise is. It basically, there's a function that goes in it, which can go in two ways. And it's pending until it's either resolved or rejected. And basically, you can always come back to that code, and your code will just keep running. Everything else will just keep running. All your synchronous code will just keep running until that promise resolves. Okay? So that's the story with what a promise is. So now you know what a promise is. You understand what this whole dot then thing is, and this dot catch thing is. Cool. Let's move on. So now I'm going to go back to my DOM piece here. So where's my DOM? Right here. So here I just have an index.html. I'm going to actually clear out this form from our previous exercise. I'm not going to really have anything in the body. Doesn't matter right now. I have my JavaScript linked in, and I got jQuery linked in. So first I'm going to show you 3 different ways to make a request to an API using your JavaScript, which they all use promises, which is why that promise piece was so important. Okay, so first let's use the jQuery method. But first let's actually grab an API link. Now let me grab over here. Let's go over here. And let's use random user.me. User. Here we go. This is a good practice API to play with. Okay, so just go to random user generator. I'm going to go grab the URL. So basically the idea is that, and this is what an API is. An API, for our purposes for this video, is just basically some other website. It's an application, except it's not an application with a front end. It's the back end application that sends data and receives data. And you don't interact with it necessarily in the same way you interact with a browser, where it renders HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You're communicating directly with the server by making a request, which is what we're going to be doing during this video. And that request can either, well, again, we're either sending data with that request, or we were requesting data and receiving it with that request. In this video, we're only going to request data and receive it. And that's all done using promises, because who knows how long that server is going to take to respond. Could take seconds. So in that case, let's say we have a URL here. Okay, this is going to be the URL we use. So I'm going to go back to my JavaScript file. Let me just delete all this stuff from the previous video. Okay. And what I want to do is, in jQuery, there is an Ajax function. Okay, and that's kind of what they use here in the example. Where am I doing? Here we go. So again, we have the jQuery thing. And then we can go .ajax. Okay? Because again, everything in jQuery is built around that $ object. Okay? And then what you do here is you just pass in the URL. Okay? To keep it real simple, we're just making a GET request, meaning we're just requesting information. So I'm not going to be dealing with like post requests and put requests and all that stuff today. But basically what this does is it says, hey, this URL, you have information. Can I have it? And again, that's a promise. So it returns a promise. So let's say I want to store this information. So I'm making this request and I say const hello equals save. Okay, and again, this function returns a promise. So watch what's going to happen. Save, if I were to go thinking I'm getting back the information, console.log, the result of that. Save. Let's see what I get. Nope, wrong file. For this, we need to go to the DOM. So let's open with live server. Let's open up the inspector so we can see what's in the console. Okay. Where is that coming from? Oh yeah, this is the promise. Okay, so you can see the promise status. Here we go. Then abort, always, catch, done. You're seeing all the stuff that comes inside the promise. So yeah, I want to actually take a look at the actual promise. Okay, name promise, state response text. Cool. Okay, so it happened pretty quickly, so you can see it. But now let's say I do this: console.log hello, console.log cheese. I want to see which console log will show up first. Okay, so let that refresh. Cool. Okay, so yeah, so that responds pretty quickly, so you don't even see it. It actually resolves before my console.log. But if actually I did this, let's do this. But now if I want to use that data, okay, because if I try to use it, if I said, hey, you know, if I go back to over here and we take a look at it, I get this response, and here's a response text. I get all this text. Here's the response JSON. There's all this stuff, info. You know, it takes a while to find it, and like it's all hidden in here. That's not super useful. Okay, so the way this function works is actually going to respond with that JSON if you choose the .then, because that's what it actually sends when it resolves. So what I'm going to want to do is do a .then. So if I do, let's actually try chaining it off the hello. Why not? Let's see if that works. Usually I would just chain it off the Ajax function, but I'd like to see if this works. Okay, so again, the data we get back is called the response. Doesn't have to be the word response, but usually when you're making a GET request, you're making a request and you're going to get back a response. So it just makes it easier to think of it that way. And let's console.log the response. So again, since it returns a promise, I can use that dot then to run what I want to run when the promise is done. So let's console log what response is. Save. Okay. And there, see, we get this array called results. And in here, I can go grab results and find the array. Okay, so now, and that's always the first thing you want to do when you're making a call to any API. You want to console log the response and take a look at what the data looks like, because it looks different for every API. Other APIs may not have an object with info and results. Other ones may have like an array of something, or the data, or it might just be a string. You know, you always have to look at it first. So always console log your response first. So basically the data I really want is inside response.results 0. Okay, so really that user we pulled down is response.results 0. Okay, and this is always the first thing you should be doing with your API, is kind of trying to figure out where the results are. Where's the information you want? And then console logging and testing it. So now if I do this, see, now I'm getting just the object that is the user. Okay, cool. But again, I'm using the dot then because it returns a promise. How do I know it returns a promise? Because you read the documentation, but now you can tell whenever we're using this dot then function, whatever we're chaining it off of must be a promise. And what does this function do? It returns a promise. Again, I don't have to chain it off. I don't have to store it in a variable. I could have just done it right off of this. So I could have just do this dot then response console.log response save. Okay, and you see there, cheese happens first, because now the response is taking a little bit longer. So basically, the response, and the dot waits for the response to resolve, and the cheese console log runs before the actual thing resolves. Okay, but there you go. So that's how you would do it if you're using, but this is a jQuery function. This only exists in jQuery. So if you're not using jQuery, what are your other options? In JavaScript, they have something natively called fetch. So I could use fetch to do the same thing. Okay, actually, let me just, don't need to do all that. I could literally just replace this with fetch. Okay, and then I can do that. Save. Okay. Now if I do that, let's take a look. See, now I get this whole response object, which has all this other information in it. And what I really just want is the data. Okay, I just want the response. I'm like, where is all my stuff? Okay, here in the body. And you know, you have to look around and you have to find it. So usually what you do when you're using fetch, which is again the thing that's built into JavaScript, you go through multiple steps. So for the first dot then, you want to take that response and turn it into JSON. So basically what you do is usually you do response.json. Okay. So what this does, it takes the data that was part of the response and turns it into a JSON object, or basically it parses the JSON. But again, this dot then, the cool thing about dot then is that it returns a promise too. So anything you do in the dot then gets returned as part of the promise that is the dot then. So I can chain another dot then off of it. So dot then, and then say, hey, the JSON data I just received, so I'm going to call it JSON, because you always get the resolution of the previous promise. That's what's happening. Okay. So in that case, now I can console.log. Actually, I'll use curly brackets. Console.log JSON. So basically, again, just to kind of recap here, this fetch here, the first fetch, grabs the data, makes the request. When that promise resolves, this dot then happens, takes the data that we received and parses it, because it comes back as a string. It comes back as a JSON string. We haven't actually parsed it into an object yet. Then we parse that string, turn it into an actual JSON object that I can now use and log. And now let's take a look at what we see here. And see, now this looks a lot better. I open this up. There's my results. That looks a lot better than what we had before. Okay, so that's how you would do it with fetch. So with fetch, you always kind of have to take that extra step, this sort of middle dot then. And because that kind of annoys people having to do that extra step, what a lot of people have, but not everyone wants to go then load up jQuery. What a lot of people have become fans of is using something called Axios. So let's look up Axios and add that in there. So Axios CDN. Here we go. And copy script tag. And we'll just add that to our other script tags here. So there's the Axios. We'll bring in Axios, and it's the same deal. Again, it just returns a promise. So again, I just replaced this with Axios. The only difference is I don't need this middle step. With Axios, that works because it already parses the responses JSON for you. You don't have to do that extra step of parsing it yourself. Okay, so if I do this, we'll just have our data. Okay. And sorry for all the sirens. I do live in a noisy neighborhood in Brooklyn. So let's see here. Let's take a look at the browser and take a look at our thing here. And there you go. See, look, it's right there. And then it's in this section called data. Okay. And that's the thing with Axios. It always puts it in as data. So basically you get this object with a bunch of information, and then the results you want are inside data. And there it is. There's the whatnot. So each one kind of just will return you the data slightly differently, but they all work on the same premise, where basically you have a core function, whether it's Ajax, Fetch, or Axios, which returns a promise from the request for information to the URL you passed it, and then you say what you want to do once that information arrives using the .then, and then. If you guys ever seen Dude, Where's My Car? And that's it. That's basically now you know how to do GET requests to any API that you want. But again, before you just start taking that data and populating it to the DOM using jQuery or plain vanilla DOM manipulation, always take some time console logging the data so that way you know where your data is. Because by looking at this, now I know if I want to get to that user, that's going to be in this object in a data property. So response.data.results 0. Okay, that was different than before. So actually, technically, it's JSON. So it's JSON.data.results 0. And that takes some time. Every API is different, and every API has the data structured differently. So you first make the call successfully, and then kind of figure out where the data is. And that's always, and then do what you want with the data, whether you need to work with it silently or you need to put it on the DOM or whatever. But let's just show you. See, there I go. There's my object, and then from there I can be like dot date of birth, dot ID, dot location, dot login information, dot name, dot picture, all this kind of cool information. So yeah, so basically in less than half an hour we've learned what promises are. We've learned how to use the jQuery.ajax function, the built-in JavaScript fetch function, and we've learned how to use the Axios function for making GET requests. They pretty much all, for the most part, work the same. So once you learn the ins and outs of one versus the other, they all kind of do the same. But once you understand that under the hood it's just a promise, it gets pretty easy to work with them versus learning how to work with them without really understanding what promises are. So hopefully you guys found this video useful. Have a great day and enjoy. I'll see you guys later.